absence of fear, but action in the face of fear. The author of that quotation is anonymous, but it describes best the remarkable story of bravery displayed by our Filipino, mostly Ilocano brothers, together with American soldiers in defeating the Japanese forces stationed in San Fernando, La Union in 1945. This is Mary Jane Ortega sharing with you the victory of Bacsil Ridge. Bacsil Ridge of the city of San Fernando in the province of La Union is 10 kilometers east of the city hall. It was the site of the first major victory against the Japanese up in the north. World War II began on a lazy Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, in the United States, which was about 3 a.m. of December 8 in the Philippines. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and 9 hours later on the same day of December 8, 54 Japanese Mitsubishi G3M and G4M bombers dropped tons of bombs on Clark Air Base and then went on to Iba, Zambales. 2 weeks later, on December 22, 1941, Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa came to the beaches of La Union with 84 warships, bringing in with him 55,000 veterans of war, and decided to make San Fernando the center of their stronghold in northern Luzon. His mission? To conquer the entire Philippines within 50 days. This was a surprise to General Douglas MacArthur because he thought that the Japanese would land at Lingayen Beach and not in La Union. General MacArthur had 100,000 soldiers, but they were trainees who had only 2 or 3 months training against the 55,000 veteran soldiers of the Japanese. When the American defense of the Philippines collapsed by March 1942, General MacArthur left the islands and said,
"I shall return."
After the fall of Bataan and before Corregidor finally fell to the Japanese forces, U.S. Army infantry officer Colonel Russell W. Faulkman refused to surrender to the Japanese forces. He escaped to the mountains of northern Luzon and assisted in establishing a more organized resistance against the Japanese. He became the commander of the United States Armed Forces in the Philippines, Northern Luzon, or USAFIP NL. He had under him the 121st Infantry, headed by Major George Barnett. At the start of the Battle of Luzon, Colonel Faulkman had a force of 8,000 guerrillas and later grew to 18,000 when they were supplied with ammunitions. They chose San Gabriel, a town high up in the mountains east of San Fernando, as their center of operations for the campaign of the liberation of San Fernando. In 1943, ammunitions, 35 tons, were brought in by a submarine USS Gar to Darigayos, Luna, and the place is now called Camp Spencer, named after Australian Grafton Spencer, the first fatality in 1943. Camp Spencer was the site of the GHQ and was the center and base of operations of the USAFIP NL. Civilians who carried the ammunitions from Camp Spencer in Luna to San Gabriel were called bolomen, and they armed the guerrillas in 1944 for the attack on the Japanese forces in early 1945. The 121st Infantry under Major George Barnett had 3 battalions. The 1st Battalion was under Major Eduardo Borge, who was in charge of capturing Bacsil Ridge in San Fernando. On this site in 1959, a marker was installed by the Philippine Historical Commission, which reads, How was this accomplished? According to the accounts of then Lieutenant Gregorio Bunog Ufano, he was with his brother, Lieutenant Juan Johnny Balyodo Ufano. They were tasked by Major Barnett to conquer Bacsil Ridge from the east, Balyodong Ufano coming from the southeast, Bunog Ufano coming from the northeast. Since 1996, Colonel Bunog Ufano, whose statue you can see up here, would join us to celebrate the victory of Bacsil Ridge, and he shared with us his personal accounts on what happened during that horrific day. He said, "I wanted to retreat. I was trembling with fear and quite nervous. I did not know whether we would die or be victorious, but if I would retreat, my brother would be left alone and might die." His mantra on that day was no retreat, only advance on to victory. But they were undermanned. So Major Barnett ordered the U.S. Air Force planes standing by at Poro Point to proceed to Bacsil Ridge and give them air support, which they badly needed. And while the Japanese were scrambling for their lives from the planes strafing Bacsil Ridge, the Ufano brothers, together with the infantrymen, carefully sneaked up and engaged the Japanese in hand-to-hand combat. And finally, they won. I had the opportunity to interview the owner of this land. He's called Mang Arding Martinez. He was only 9 years old then, and I asked him, "How many Japanese did you see scattered and lying dead on this lot? How many were Filipinos?" And you know what he said? "Oh, I don't know. I cannot tell if they were Japanese or Filipinos. I was too scared and in shock. I did not look at the color of the skin. All I could see were mounds of dead bodies." And Mang Arding continued, "My father decided to burn all the dead bodies that were not claimed, because he said if he would not have done so, the birds of prey would feast on them. And you know, until now, I cannot forget the stench of burning flesh." One of the lessons I've learned from this anecdote is that the eyes of a child do not see the color of the skin. The child only sees the tragedy, the violence, and the dead bodies of human beings. We also give credit to the 2nd Battalion, which claimed victory at Insurrecto Hill, the place near the provincial capital where you can see the tunnels where Japanese forces were finally defeated on March 21, 1945, under Major Diego Sipin's command. And the 3rd Battalion, under Major Conrado Rigor, captured the Reservoir Hill, also on the same day of March 21, 1945. At that time, a group of Japanese soldiers were also positioned at Mount Dayawan, which overlooks Bacsil Ridge. When they saw that Bacsil Ridge fell into the hands of the Filipinos, they brought in all their ammunitions inside the cave and exploded themselves out. We have never visited Mount Dayawan because people say that whenever they go to that creepy place, they had goosebumps, feeling the ghosts of the Japanese soldiers who committed mass suicide. And so, as we now look back at March 19, 1945, we remember the heroes behind this victory. The victory that paved the way to the victory of Besang Pass and to the victory where we were able to pin down General Yamashita, which finally led to his imprisonment at Camp Spencer and eventual surrender in Baguio City in September 1945. This was the start of the liberation not only of the town port of San Fernando, but the liberation of the North and eventually the liberation of the entire Philippines. Fast forward, my husband, then Congressman Victor F. Ortega, filed a bill for the cityhood of San Fernando and chose March 20, 1998 as a date of the plebiscite for its cityhood. The citizens came out and voted for cityhood overwhelmingly. Victor chose March 20 because it was the death anniversary of his late father, the Speaker pro tempore Francisco I. Ortega, who filed a bill in 1949 for the cityhood of San Fernando. But his dream was not accomplished during his lifetime. When Victor chose March 20, he did not foresee that this would lead to a 3-day celebration for the city of San Fernando. March 19 for the victory of Bacsil Ridge in 1945, March 20 for the cityhood of San Fernando in 1998, and March 21, 1945 for the liberation of the whole town of San Fernando. It was in 1969 when I first heard about this marker of Bacsil Ridge, but I could not see the marker because it was covered by cogon. There were no steps that led up to the marker, and my heart fell, and I said, how can we forget a marker that signifies a victory over our enemies? And so I'm very glad that now we have these steps, and since 1996, we started the Victory of Bacsil Ridge celebrations with a Holy Mass for those who died in this place, whether they were Filipinos or Japanese. This is a place where we had the first taste of victory in the North. This place where we had Filipinos, we had Ilocanos, and Americans who shed their blood so that we can all enjoy our freedom and our liberty. When I was mayor of San Fernando, I put up the peace pole, inspired by the peace statue at Nagasaki, Japan, as a reminder that we should preserve peace in our country, because in war, whether we are the victors or the vanquished, we will all be losers. Kapayapaan, kapya, peace, peace too.
Mayor Alfred Ortega invited me to the Committee on Culture, Arts, and Heritage. That inspired me to produce this video documentary,
The Victory of Bacsil